evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to St Hugh's College and to the Dixon Boone building, which is our newest asset on the campus, which we're enormously proud. So I hope you enjoy being here, but in particular I hope you're going to enjoy this evening. I think it's going to be a tremendously interesting evening tonight, and we have a cornucopia of talent here in front of you. We have, first of all, news to me, Professor Senia Paseta. She is a historian of modern Ireland, with particular focus on the history of education, religious identity formation and political movements and ideas in the late 19th and early 20th century. So it's particularly relevant given the topic of tonight's discussion is Easter 1916, politics, poetry and history in revolutionary Ireland. Senia has published on the development of a Catholic university elite in pre-independence Ireland and has also worked on a number of aspects of women's history, including the history of feminism and women's education in Ireland. Her current research is in the history of women and political activism in Britain and Ireland. The most recent publication, the book Irish Nationalist Women 1900 to 1918, was published in 2013, and it examines how politically active women worked within the broader nationalist and feminist context during that volatile period of Irish history. She's now working on a volume which considers further forms of women's political activism, including Irish nationalism, or unionism, I should say, socialism and education and social reform. Senia is co-director of Women in Humanities programme in the Oxford Centre for Research in Humanities, and is a member of the steering committee of the History Faculty Centre for Gender Identity and Subjectivity. She's also involved in a number of public history initiatives to mark the centenary of Ireland's revolutionary decade, and she has been a sterling member of our fellowship here in St Hugh's for a number of years. Recently, she was a panellist for our premiere of the film Suffragette here in Oxford, which was based on another of our alumni, Emily Davidson. We also are joined this evening by Professor Peter McDonald, who's also a tutorial fellow here at St Hugh's. Peter has written extensively on the history of literature as a category from the 19th century to the present day, on publishing history, and on the relationship between literary institutions and the modern state. His most recent publication is The Literature Police, Apartheid, Censorship and its Cultural Consequences, and his other principal publications include British Literary Culture and Publishing Practice, and Making Meaning, Printers of the Mind, and other essays. Peter describes his research interests as the socio-political space of literary production, 1880 to present, literature and the law since 1800, literary institutions and questions of the book, ideas of the intercultural. And again, Peter is a senior fellow here within the college, and again, it's great to have the two of them here together, and indeed to be joined again by a newer member of our fellowship, Professor David Doyle. David joined us 2 years ago now, is it? Three? And he is Associate Professor of Latin American Politics in the Department of Politics and International, and a member of the Latin American Centre. His general research and teaching interests include comparative politics and comparative political economy, and he currently has 4 major overlapping strands in his work, broadly revolving around executives, ideology and political economy. His most recent project, which is just beginning, is in how we develop and learn about ideology, both as children and adults, and how this shapes our political behaviour. It's great to have 3 of them. Tonight's lecture is taking a different format because we have, as I say, the opportunity to hear from 3 of our distinguished fellows here in St Hugh's. We will hear from, I think, is it Senia who's going to speak first, followed by Peter and then David, and then we're going to open for a discussion with the panel and any questions we want to have on a topic which is of huge interest given the centenary this Easter. I think at least we have one member of our audience who was alive at the time of the Easter Rising, Brenda Reynolds, who is our senior fellow here today. In fact, she's 101, nearly 102 now. And so delighted to have someone who, I think you said you did 2 at the time of it, Brenda. So, but as I say, other than that, I'm sure we'll hear and learn much more about it ourselves this evening from Senia. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. That's absolutely, I'm sure we'll agree, excruciating. I think we should do that while we're out of the room and then allow us to come in. Okay, so I'm going to speak generally about the Easter Rising in 10 minutes, which is not easy, and I have some pictures as well, as you can see. I suppose the first thing to say about the Easter Rising is that the day before it began, on Easter Monday in 1916, everybody who knew anything about it thought it was going to be a disaster. Everybody knew that it would lead to bloodshed, everybody knew that militarily it almost certainly would fail. One of the participants, James Connolly, who was a socialist, said, "We are going out to be slaughtered," as he walked out on Easter Monday. And it's been said many, many times before, it's worth saying again, that the Easter Rising was not predictable, it was not popular, it was a shock event. Nobody really expected it apart from this very small group of people who organised it. Nonetheless, it is a turning point in modern Irish history, and it is a real preoccupation of people like us, literary scholars, political scientists and historians. So I think historians have spent a lot of time, this year in particular, but since I started doing Irish history, thinking about why the Rising went ahead, despite the fact that most people knew that it really would fail. And the bare, any examination of the bare facts of the Rising showed that it just couldn't have worked. Any rational person would have seen that it couldn't work. About 1,000 people turned out on Easter Monday, and they were joined by maybe 600 more as the week went on. They turned out to face the British Army, which, although it was preoccupied with the First World War, nonetheless had several garrisons, lots of soldiers, lots of weapons in Ireland, so it wasn't really a good idea to take on the British Army at that point, or any, in fact. Even though the army was distracted in some ways, they managed to overcome the rebels in 5 days pretty easily and pretty catastrophically. And the costs of this bloodshed were quite significant. The army reported casualties of 116 dead, and I think it's interesting and important that we acknowledge that 16 of those were Irish men, policemen. 22 of them were Irish soldiers who joined the British Army to fight in the First World War. Civilian casualties totalled 318 dead and well over 2,000 injured. And that's a lot in 5 days. The vast majority of casualties, either injured or killed, were civilians, and 40 of those were under 10 years old. This is one of them. This is a little boy called Sean Foster, who was shot by crossfire while he was being wheeled in a pram by his mother Katie Foster. His father, John Foster, had been killed the year before on the Western Front, fighting in the British Army. He was a nationalist. Katie's brother, so Sean's uncle, Joseph O'Neill, was fighting with the Irish rebels in the GPO. And horribly, the bullet that shot his nephew, that killed his nephew, came from exactly where his uncle was standing. And these kinds of stories of multiple human and familial tragedies were not uncommon. Whole communities were torn apart by grief and destruction. And this included some of the families of the ringleaders as well. Tom Clark, one of the leaders of the Rising, left his pregnant wife, who was executed. There's really a sense of some of the scale of the destruction of Dublin in the period. Kathleen Clark was, as I say, pregnant. Her husband was executed, and so was her younger brother, her only brother, within 2 days of one another. She went into such deep shock that she lost her child and fell into a period of very serious ill health. She, though, had her family business to take care of. She and her husband ran a radical news agent in Dublin, believe it or not. I think we should have one in Oxford. I like the idea of a radical news agent. But most families didn't have anything like it, and many of the families of the rebels, the leaders, never recovered emotionally or financially or in any way from the loss of their fathers and husbands and sons. And I have a colleague who's working on a big project on the children of the revolution, and it is just truly tragic. It's almost like a curse. Hardly any of them did well in any way. So we know a good deal about the leaders of the Rising. We know less so about some of the innocent victims. And we'll talk a little bit about them. And another woman, apart from Sean Foster, Lizzie Walsh, someone I've sort of come to know through my research. She was a servant at the Metropole Hotel, and that is the Metropole Hotel there, next door to the GPO, which was the main garrison. That's the Metropole Hotel before. She lost her job, she lost all of her clothes, she lost every single thing she owned in the world, including letters from her mother. when the hotel was destroyed, but she was really, really brave. She wasn't political, but she spent years writing claims for compensation, and her compensation claims are some of the most touching things that any historian could see. She listed every glove, every sock, every stocking, every pen she owned. She got none of them back. And her life was destroyed. You know, she had real anxiety about this. She couldn't work. Most of Dublin slowed down. There was very little work. It was very difficult to get supplies in for a few days. So her livelihood and her grief was no less acute, I think, than many others for having not been a combatant herself. There are many, many thousands of equally touching stories about loss and destruction. And it's been interesting to me this year, seeing I've been involved in a lot of 1916 stuff, how much of it is focused around people like Lizzie Walsh, around Sean Foster, much less than around the leaders. It's got a lot to do with Ireland's political climate now. So when thinking about all these deaths and all this destruction, we still come back, I think, to this question of why. Why did they do this? Why did they go ahead with this? And they must have known that it would fail and be enormously costly. And there are a number of explanations for this. Some historians to this day will continue to argue that they could have won, that they really thought they could have won, that they could have put up enough of a fight that would have encouraged people from all around Ireland to join them. I don't myself believe that explanation. I haven't got time to go into it now, but I think it's a very, very difficult case to make. Others have argued, I think more convincingly, that the rising was really nothing much more than a blood sacrifice, a symbolic gesture, made really because the leaders were poets rather than soldiers, and they were committed to the idea of sacrifice in the tradition of Irish republicanism. And some of the leaders felt very ashamed. They felt the generation had let down Irish republicanism by not rising against Britain, as generations had over the 19th century. And historical accounts of the rising, I think, have been shrouded in this language of sacrifice and generation, in regeneration. And this is inevitable given that it happens at Easter, of course. And also that many of the leaders of the rising were deeply, deeply religious, particularly Patrick Pearse, often seen as the leader of the Easter Rising. His language, like the language of many writers, and he was a poet as well as a lawyer and a teacher, his language became much more militaristic from 1912, 1913. 1915, he said, "Ireland will not find Christ's peace until she's taken Christ's sword. What peace she has known in these later days has been the devil's peace, peace with sin, peace with dishonour. Bloodshed was a cleansing and sanctifying thing." Now, he was only one of the most prolific writers among the rebels, but he wasn't the only one. And it's striking, I'm sorry if this goes into what you're going to say, Peter, but it is striking how much radical politics was done in this period, conducted in this period in theatres, in lecture halls, in libraries, in literary groups, in study circles. And the cult of the gun that was sweeping Europe at this time was celebrated through poetry and prose and drama. And there were practical connotations of this as well. Drama, the plays, the poetry, the dances, the language classes, all the rest of it, they paid the guns that ended up being used in 1916. So literature pays, in many cases, for this rising. Now, other historians have also focused on this idea, which I find interesting, that in some ways these rebels didn't care what they did, that they were obliged as militant Republicans to put up a fight, and what they wanted was to cause as much destruction as possible. Because proportionately, the destruction they caused in Dublin was very, very high to the numbers of weapons they had and so on. Mainly because when they rose, most of their garrisons in the city were in quite heavily populated areas. I think the truth of why they did this is a mixture of all these ideas, and also I think the more banal fact of the rising tide of violence that swept Europe from around 1912, and Ireland was not exempt from this, of course. The Easter Rising was as much a product of the First World War as it was of the Republican imagination. Its victims were no less casualties of war as were the people, their compatriots in Belgium and France. And the impact of the war, you can see this is a postcard. This is one of many postcards that was sent, actual postcards, souvenirs. This is a big industry. These were sent all over the world. And we can see from these photographs, so many of them, that it looked as though the European war had arrived in Dublin. And people were fascinated by this. And there was a war tourism. People came to Dublin, people who felt they'd missed out and wanted to see what had happened. People who had been there wanted to try to understand it through pictures and so on. And this was very common. Lots of writers and so on were touring France while the guns were blazing behind them. It was Wharton, in fact, most famously. War tourism began actually while the fighting was still going on. And one of the striking things about the Rising is how so many people just walked around between garrisons, meeting their friends, talking to each other, drinking cups of tea while the bombs and guns were flying. So I think the Easter Rising is now, I think, seen by historians as absolutely part of the story of the First World War. I think we've got plenty more to think about in terms of its violence, in terms of its destruction and causation. We need to think of it in terms of the First World War, but we also need to think more transnationally, I think, and in broader political terms. I don't have time for this, but my obsession with 1916 is how much it owed to suffrage and feminism. There's strong strains of that throughout the whole thing. The Easter Rising was a profoundly Irish event, of course. It was steeped in Irish history and tradition. Anyone who knows it can see it all over, all of the various things that were done and said over the week. But it was an international event, as I've said. It was dependent on wider political and cultural ideas. And I think that it's only in studying all these various things, which is why this is great, having people from different perspectives, that we can begin to truly appreciate not only why it happened, but also what it inspired.
To switch on technology. Anybody know how to get rid of this? Sorry, I'm getting that. As you can see, this panel has been cunningly designed to have people from different disciplinary backgrounds, but I should also add that it's not only a question of, in my case, of disciplinary background, it's also levels of expertise. So when it comes to Easter 1916, I'm an absolute dabbler. And I'm, in fact, in some ways, I'm also professionally committed to dabbling generally, but it's not entirely out of character. But I had to ask myself and face the same question as Senia: what on earth can I say in 10 minutes about this? So that's the major constraint in which I've operated. And what I've decided I could possibly say, apart from not very much, in 10 minutes, is I could give you some evidence and I could ask one question. And the question is this: what is it that we, or people, want from literature when it comes to an event of this magnitude, importance, courage, idealism, and all the things that Senia has been mentioning? What do people want? And I think Senia has actually already touched on my first point, miraculously, because we hadn't conferred beforehand. One of the things that people want from literature in the face of these sorts of events is endorsement, mobilization, the support of art for the cause in one way or another. So in other words, plays, poems, songs, fictions of various kinds that are in some ways a supplement to a document like this. This is the proclamation. As Dane Ellis mentioned, I have an interest in not only in these sorts of documents, but in their production and materiality. So this is simply just because I wanted, Senia is the expert on this document in every respect, and I'm desperate to try to mention one thing you may have not have noticed. So before I go on about this document, let me just show you one thing. It was produced under duress by 3 printers. And in fact, they had so little type that they printed half and then ran that off and then reused the type to print the bottom half. But they also had too few E's in the primary font that they wanted to use. So the only reason why I'm saying this for Senia's sake, because I'm trying to say something that she hasn't spotted, although she probably has. But I'm also saying it for your sake, because there are, of course, millions of these things now available. And the one way you can spot a fake, of course you can get all of these on the internet as well, but if you're getting a genuine article, the one way you can spot the genuine article is when, I don't know if you can see clearly enough there, but can you see that the E's in sovereign, which is kind of appropriate as well, are different. There's a different set of E's. Anyway, once you've got that, you can see that you've got the genuine version that was printed as opposed to the fake. Anyway, that's not really what I wanted to talk about. When we're talking about what do people want from literature, well, you get the sorts of things that Senia touched on, and that are really, I'm also going to mention this because of what I may or may not come to right at the end. You get these sorts of statements, which is right at the end of the document. We place the cause of the Irish Republic under the protection of the Most High God, whose blessing we invoke upon our arms, and we pray that no one who serves that cause will dishonor it by cowardice, inhumanity, or rapine. So, calls into turning the call one, mobilizing people to be noble, to act in the best of all possible intentions. That is one of the things that we want from literature, and certainly that, as Senia mentioned, the East in 1916, the Rising, in the years before and indeed after, produced a lot of that kind of cause-based literature. However, people also want other things from literature, especially afterwards. And one of the things that, if we think of it as now in the more realist tradition of writing, people will want literary works that perform something like this kind of thing in a newspaper, which is reportage, to report what happened, to recount what happened. And people would often look to literature to recount what happened in a way that was more oriented towards human interest and the felt experience of being there than a newspaper report. But it would nonetheless still be a kind of supplement to a newspaper report. And I also just decided to focus on this for 2 reasons as an example. One is, first of all, just this is the first time, which I was talking to Senia earlier, they did cut the Telegraph. But I'm surprised, nonetheless, that the London Times this is the first time this is reported. It's on the 26th, as you can see, Wednesday the 26th, after Monday the 24th. And it's reported amongst a whole lot of other things. And it's reported on page 6. And it's not mentioned in the table of contents of what is in the newspaper. So you get a rebel Irish rising, naval battle off Lowestoft, a Zeppelin raid, further fighting in Egypt, and then you get this report. This is how it's reported. The first reporting of it in the Times. I'll come to something in a moment. A rising in Ireland, an attack by German warships on the east coast, and a Zeppelin raid, all apparently parts of a concerted German plan, are recorded today. At noon on Monday, serious disturbances broke out in Dublin. A large body of armed men occupied Stephen's Green, took possession of the post office and held houses in the neighbourhood and on the quays. Okay, it goes on. That's the first report. So that's the one thing. Another thing that people can expect from literature. Some sort of reportage, a form of witness literature, if you like, to these sort of things. The other thing that people often expect from literature, and I'm afraid I think this has now become the dominant expectation of certainly of the novel, even today, is people expect something that is like editorializing, some kind of fairly well-articulated opinion, essentially, on great events of the world. We look to novels and things like that to tell us what to think about great events of the world. In other words, we look to them in a way that's similar to looking to an editorial in a newspaper whose opinions we respect. We want these editorializing opinions. So you get something like this. This is in the same newspaper, 26th, but it's on page 7, and it's the editorial. I'll just read you the first bit, just to give you an idea of what editorializing opinion was like in the Times in relation to Ireland in 1916, the Irish disturbances. The Germans have always counted upon armed insurrection in Ireland. First sentence. They have striven to provoke it from the outbreak of the war, and at last they have succeeded in getting their dupes to indulge in an insane rising. The statements published by lawful authority, nice use of quotation marks, which alone are available, leave its proportions and the general situation obscure, but there is no doubt about the main features. It is evidently the result of a carefully arranged plot concocted between the Irish traitors and their German confederates. Okay. Editorial opinionizing in the Times on Wednesday, 26th of April 1916. Okay, so those are the things that people can expect from literature. The language of mobilization, the language of witness, testimony, and the language of editorializing opinion. What we get, however, when we look at 1916, is a number of other things as well. And this is where literature, it's one of the reasons why I study it, and I'm interested in it, becomes a tricky thing in the public domain. Of course, one of the most famous things that you got from 1916 was the following. And I'm showing it to you in a very particular format, for a very particular reason. So this is Yeats's famous poem, which I'm sure most of you know. I don't am I right? I just everybody has had this put in front of them at some point. Okay, so I'm not going to go into it in much detail. I just want to say a few things about it. One is, partly because of my interest in publishing history, is this was one of 25 copies of this poem printed privately by an English magazine editor called Clement Shorter for his friends, probably in 1917, when it was actually printed, although the date on it is 1916. Yeats responded to the event, began to draft this poem in May. Immediately afterwards, but he only finished it in September. It appeared in this volume, in, let's say, probably it was circulated in 1917. Yeats did not publish this poem again until the 1920, and then it was in 2 international small magazines. And then only again did it appear in Ireland, in a sense, publicly for the first time in 1921 in Michael Robartes and the Dancer, which is published by the Cooler Press, a small Irish specialist art press, if you like, with which Yeats had a special relationship. So, an interesting thing in terms of a poem, there's a clear sense that, in the sense that Yeats knew this was not going to be a simple poem to publish in Ireland at that time. And it's not simple for a number of reasons. One of the things that it does, of course, and these are the famous lines from it right at the end, and as you can see, there's the Clement Shorter signature at the bottom, the fact that at 25, this is the privately printed edition. What it does, of course, is it memorializes the event. You know, I write it out in verse, McDonald and McBride and Connolly and Peirce. So now it's one thing you can know how to say the word Pierce, Peirce, verse, Peirce, although Yeats is, anyway. Wherever, now and time to be, wherever green is worn, you did notice the colour of the cover, by the way, it was a brighter green originally, or changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. Okay, so yes, that's one of the things that this poem does, is it does memorialize the event, and it talks about radical and terrible transformation. But it also includes a whole series of other things. one of them being Yeats's own reflections about his deep ambivalence about the event and the people involved, the vivid faces walking out. There's a lot of class language about clerks and the lower orders generally taking part in this event. But then there's also this very strange middle section, which has these lines. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone. To trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, it then goes on to this whole series of naturalistic descriptions about the world moving and turning and doing its thing. And then it comes to the next line, at the end of that sentence, the stones in the midst of all, too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. I'm not going to talk about the language here, except to say, we can come back to it in the questions if you like, except to say that it is not at all obvious what Yeats is in fact talking about. I don't know what he means. I've got some thoughts. I don't know what he means by heart. I don't know what he means by the metaphor of the stone, and though I can also add some things. But the language suddenly takes on not the sense of naming these names, these are these people, and memorializing. It suddenly enters into a whole world of Yeatsian private language, which is very, very charged and very, very weighed down with his own attitudes towards not only the uprising, but to the discourse of politics in general. But as I say, I'll come back to it. One last item. So yes, we expect, so maybe literature gives us memorialization, maybe literature gives us, in the Yeatsian case, a very complex set of responses. However, we also get things like this. This is much later, 1947. It's called On est toujours trop bon avec les femmes, and it's by Sally Mara, traduit de l'irlandais par Michel Presel, and it's published by Édition du Scorpion. This is an optical illusion. It is a novel, a fiction called On est toujours trop bon avec les femmes, which was in fact made into a film in 1971. But there's no such Irish woman writer as Sally Mara. There's no such translator as Michel Presel, how you pronounce that name. And it is in fact a bit of experimental fiction from 1947, first published by the small avant-garde French post-war publisher, Édition du Scorpion, by Raymond Queneau. In 1971, a much more conspicuously highbrow French publisher brought it out, and in 1981 it was translated into English as We Always Treat Women Too Well, and published by Raymond Calder. It's now available in this edition. Okay, I'm not going to go into the details. I'll just quickly read you the blurb because I must now finish. Suffice it to say, well, let me read you the blurb. The blurb is a fairly good description of it. Published originally as the purported French translation of a novel by a fictional writer, Sally Mara, We Always Treat Women Too Well is set in Dublin during the 1916 Easter Rising and tells the story of the siege of a small post office, in other words, not the GPO, by a group of rebels who discover to their embarrassment that a female postal clerk, Gertie Girdle, is still in the lavatory sometime after they have shot and expelled the rest of the staff. The events that follow are not for prudish readers, forming scintillating, linguistically delightful, and hilarious narrative. I'll stop there. I'll just say, I'll say two things very, very briefly. One is, I'll say one thing very briefly. The rebels, two things very briefly. All the characters' names are based on characters out of James Joyce's Ulysses, and the rebels' password, which they have to both to indicate who they are and to motivate themselves. Their own motivational phrase is Finnegan's Wake.
So I'm going to finish this talk by commenting on politics in Ireland. I would love to be able to say I dabbled in 1916, and in fact I don't go near it. All my research is on the political economy of Latin America. Most of my work is large quantitative studies of electoral behavior in Latin American countries. So in many respects I have no real right to be standing here. I am Irish, as some of you may have guessed from my accent. And what I'm about to say is really my own musings. It's not backed by any type of scholarly endeavor or years of expertise or research. So having said that, take what I'm going to say with a pinch of salt. There is a joke in Ireland, and that joke is that if everybody who claimed their grandparents or relations were in the GPO on the first day of the rising, well then the GPO would have to be about the size of Phoenix Park, which is the largest urban park in Western Europe. It houses its own herd of deer. And this is because, or what I would suggest is because, is that the Irish 1916 Rising has become really a central foundational myth to the Irish state. I don't have any relations in the GPO on that particular day, but I do have some quite strong links to family links to Irish nationalism, so I'll put them on the table first. My mother's grandfather is someone called B.T. Daly. And B.T. Daly was a member of the IOB, and by 1903, he was one of the three-person executive on the IOB. He was one of the founders of Come On the Nail. He was also the first president of official Sinn Féin, and when it merged with Arthur Griffith's organization, he was on the national executive. His true passion was labour, however, and he was elected secretary of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. He ran the ITTW, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, when Jim Larkin was in prison in Wales in 1910. He was one of the founding members with James Connolly of the Irish Labour Party. And he was also one of the founding members of the Irish Citizens' Army. He wasn't in the GPO in 1916 because he'd been arrested and placed in Frankcock internment camp in Wales because he was deemed a danger to the state by the British authorities at the time. He was then imprisoned in Reading Jail, which is just up the road, so I'm sure he'd be shocked to find or to know that his great-grandson was standing here at Oxford University talking about his exploits. He shared a cell with Arthur Griffiths in Reading Jail for a number of years. Having said that, my father's father, conversely, was at the same time as the Rising was occurring, was a soldier in the British Army. He was one of the 150,000 Irishmen who enlisted in the British Army and went to fight in the British Army in the First World War. And he was serving in the Middle East at the time of the Rising. So I come from a somewhat mixed, but very traditionally mixed Irish background. What I want to say is related to last weekend's elections. Some of you may know that last weekend there were elections in Ireland for my friends, my political scientist friends back in Ireland. This, of course, was their busiest week of the year when they managed to portray themselves or managed to get themselves on television numerous times. And what I want to suggest, or at least argue, is that the result of the election last weekend, which was one of electoral fragmentation, discontent or disenchantment with the major parties, and the rise of a huge number of independents linked to very specific issues, can partly be traced back to the effect that the Rising has had on the development of Irish politics and the Irish party system. And specifically, what I want to suggest is that the Rising has dampened the natural cleavage, the left-right cleavage that should have developed in Ireland as it developed in other Western European systems. In fact, what the Rising managed to do was to unite labour groups and to unite nationalist groups under the one banner. The blood sacrifice of the Rising's leaders and that subsequent veneration by subsequent generations of Irish people created a single issue dimension in Irish politics. And this issue dimension was one of Irish nationalism. It was one of the Irish versus the British. And as a consequence, this dampened any type of channel of representation for a traditional left-right political divide. So, Ireland has always celebrated its revolutionaries. And in fact, for those of you who know Ireland and know Ireland well, you'll know that the Irish people are a somewhat cynical, downtrodden lot who tend to take delight in failings. And we have had a long history of celebrating failed revolutions, all the way from Wolfe Tone in 1798 to Robert Emmet and glorious speech in 1803, and particularly in 1916. And as I was growing up in Ireland in school, a copy of the proclamation hung in nearly every classroom that I was in. And in fact, as a child, I remember distinctly walking along O'Connell Street, and Senia showed a picture of the GPO, and placing my fingers in the bullet holes that to this day are still in the columns of the GPO on O'Connell Street. The Rising, how did it manage to achieve this status in the Irish mind? Well, I mean, Senia touched upon this. The Rising was initially askance by the majority of the population. It was a small, esoteric group who decided to launch this Rising. It was not supported by the majority of the population within the city. But it really began, I think, or the process of establishing the Rising as this centralized, legitimizing myth began when the British authorities decided to execute the leaders of the Rising. And once they did that, Pearse had undoubtedly achieved what he was hoping for, because I think a lot of historians, and again, I'm not a historian, would suggest that Pearse wanted to be executed. What he wanted was this blood sacrifice. And once the leaders were executed, this gave rise to this opportunity to establish this foundational myth of the Irish state around the Rising, but it also had this effect of dampening what we might call traditional political cleavages. And let me take a step back and explain. I see some of my students in the audience who obviously hope have come for the free wine as opposed to hearing me speak. But one of our central understanding of politics, or one of our central theoretical understandings of politics, is driven by the works of two people, Steinrock Kahn and Martin Seymour Lipset. And they wrote a book in 1969 called Partisan Alignments and Party Structures. And what this book told us was that there was a series of historical events in Western European countries which established a long-term evolutionary effect, or had a long-term evolutionary effect on the nature of party politics within Western Europe. So, for example, we had the Reformation, which created a cleavage between those who wanted to stick to a national European-wide Catholic religion, those who wanted more regional, local independence with religious services in the language of the vernacular. We then had the French Revolution, which created this cleavage or distinction between those within society who wanted a society that was free from the influence of the church, and those who wanted the church and state to have a very strong relationship and nexus. We have the Industrial Revolution, which gives rise to this urban-rural cleavage. And then finally, we have the worker-capital cleavage, which was the cleavage primarily spawned by the Russian Revolution. And these particular types of cleavages create this primordial evolution of different groups within society. And in turn, political parties evolve to represent these groups. And depending upon how these cleavages interact and how they are constructed within a society, this gives rise to the number of parties within a particular country, and also the manner in which these parties conduct particular types of programmatic appeals or electoral appeals. So it shapes not just the number of parties, but also the ideological distribution of parties. This doesn't work in the context of Ireland. And it doesn't work in the context of Ireland because, well, first of all, the Reformation, as you all know, didn't get any traction in Ireland. The French Revolution, yes, in the 1798 rebellion of Thibault Wolfton, there was some overtures to the French Revolution, but really it was more about a cleavage between those who deemed themselves Irish and those who deemed themselves to be British. The Industrial Revolution, again, there was no Industrial Revolution in Ireland at that particular time, and in fact the cleavage that existed was again one that was overwhelmingly marked by distinction between those who perceived or self-identified as Irish and those who self-identified as British. And undergirding this particular period, of course, was the famine, which again exacerbated that particular divide, and the revolution of 1848. The one that would make sense is the last one, the worker-capital divide. And this is the cleavage that many would argue primarily, or at least did up until the 1970s, distinguish the British electoral system. Worker-capital divide did have an opportunity to arise in 1913. Some of you may know in 1913, something that my own great-grandfather P.T. Daly was heavily involved in, was one of the leaders. The workers held a general strike that lasted over a year. This is called the 1913 lockout. And this was, in some respects, emblematic of an emerging worker cleavage. But what I would suggest is that that cleavage then becomes dampened by Irish nationalism. And that is because the decision of James Connolly to engage or to subsume the Irish labour movement into the overarching umbrella of Irish nationalism. And in fact, James Connolly was not even sure whether he would join the Rising or whether the labour movement should join the Rising, and he did so at the very last minute. And of course, he is attributed with that very famous saying that Senia told to a certain degree of fatalism. He marched out the door knowing that it's going to be a complete failure. But one of the reasons he didn't want to join the Rising was because he believed that the leaders of the Rising had no concerns about struggle. And when the Rising occurred, during the particular period of the Rising, it was not exactly propitious for the emergence of a left-right cleavage or the emergence of a capital worker cleavage, because times had changed since 1913. The Irish economy was actually booming. If we look at some statistics or some figures, and I am a political economist, so I couldn't help myself. C.H. Oldham wrote a very famous study in 1919 about the state of the Irish economy after the First World War. And what he was able to demonstrate, in fact, we saw exports of things like cattle had jumped from about £4 million per annum in 1904 to 20 million by 1916. We see the same for poultry, for grain, for mutton. We also have this huge remittance effect of those who had gone to fight for the British Army were sending money back to the Irish economy. So actually, times were booming. So this was not the moment where a left-right cleavage was really going to emerge. Rather, what the Rising did, rather than creating some cleavage, which was the structure of party politics for years to do, or for years to come, rather what it did was that it united a very disparate group. It united Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Irish intellectuals, socialist and Marxist labor leaders, conservative, Catholic, middle-class nationalists, all under one banner, this opposition to Britain. And so in this way, the Rising effectively trumps economics and social issues, and it places an emphasis on one issue only, and that issue is politics, this political cleavage. And this political cleavage is then exacerbated by the anarchy of the War of Independence and the anarchy of the subsequent Civil War, which means that the initial leaders of the Rising and the leaders of the Irish Rising and those who inherited at least the leadership of the Irish Rising have an overwhelming desire for stability and order. And so what we end up with then is a newly founded conservative Irish state. And if I can just quote a historian, W.J. McCormick, who suggests that the pursuit of the Easter Proclamation's fate after 1916, together with the commemorative exercises, reveals the entrenchment of a right radical ideology which at times displays a populist rhetoric. The Irish political parties, immediately after the formation of the new state, did take a conservative turn. In many ways, they betrayed the legacies of Connolly, and Connolly's aspirations for a socialist Ireland were washed away amid this ethos of Catholic nationalism. The policies of the Labour Party in this new state were not the policies of Connolly, but the policies of Arthur Griffith. And as a result, the Labour movement doesn't really provide much of a left-leaning opposition to the new Fine Gael government of W.T. Cosgrove. And in fact, with the return of De Valera, any chance of a left-right cleavage is even further dampened. And the great F.S.L. Lyons suggested the return of Mr. De Valera and his followers to constitutional politics in 1927 not merely deprived Labour of a good part of its role, but also brought back to the foreground all those political issues which succeeded only too well after 1932 in deafening the ears of the electorate to social and economic abuses that clamoured in vain for redress. So in the early Irish state, party politics is built on a plinth celebrating the legacy of the Rising, not on the disparate political views, not on left-right social economic issues. It purely built on this plinth about celebrating the blood sacrifice of the Rising. If I quoted Gaelic, would anybody understand what I was going to say? Okay, for those of you who do, don't spoil it for your listeners. Sinna Fina Foil, a Tofi Gallagher, Gwindar Slew Hartir Alana Queen. Obviously, you know what that means. Does anybody know what that is? This was the song that was sung by the Irish volunteers in the GPO during 1916. This is what they sang as they fled to Murr Street, or supposedly, this is what they sang as they fled. And this song, does anybody know what this song now is? It's the Irish national anthem. Now let me give you the English translation. Soldiers we are, whose lives are pledged to Ireland. Some have come from a land beyond the wave, sworn to be free, no more our ancient Saarland shall shelter the despot or the slave. Tonight we man the Biernaboel, which is a dangerous gap, I guess. Yeah, okay. In errant's calls, come woe or weal, mid cannons roar and rifles peal, we'll chant a soldier's song. That's the Irish national anthem. It's like humility. As a lot of national anthems are, it has to be said. But nonetheless, this one was adopted in 1926, partly because of its role and its importance during the 1916 Rising. And so, just to finish off, what I'd suggest is that Labour becomes part of this overarching cleavage, or political dimension, that dampens this left-right cleavage in Ireland. We don't see any primordial evolution or distinction between labour-based groups and middle-class groups as should naturally happen within a society like Ireland. Rather, what we see are populist parties who all appeal to the nationalist legacy or the nationalist myth, rooted in the Rising, but carried on over into the contemporary era. All of these parties, none of whom are willing to challenge the dominance of the Catholic Church, because Catholicism becomes central to the Irish identity and becomes central to the myth of the Irish state. And while we have some challenges to these dynamics in the 1980s and 1990s, we have elements of post-materialism, we see the emergence of some sort of weakened green politics. This still remains the dominant politics, or at least it has done in the Ireland of today. Now I'm going to make a bit of a jump, but given, as I said, this talk is not informed by any scholarly expertise, I feel very comfortable making this jump. And I will suggest that what happened during the Rising will now take us 100 years later. And it's quite opposite that we hold an election 100 years after the Rising. And what that election, I would suggest, has produced, the fragmentation that that election has produced, is partly a product of this lack of a left-right cleavage within Ireland. The lack of this cleavage, which was subsumed, as I said, by this overarching myth of Irish nationalism, born and cemented within the Rising. Because what happens is that during the economic boom years of the 1990s, the Celtic Tiger, and I remember them, though of course I was doing a doctorate at the time, so I didn't benefit. We see Fianna Fáil adopts its traditional populist rhetoric, one of Celtic Tigerism and economic success. The Labour Party and Fine Gael adopt similar populist bandwagon approaches. But when all this comes crashing down in 2009, and the giant pyramid scheme that is the Irish property market collapses, the political parties are unable to provide proper channels of representation. People are discontented, people are happy, people are unhappy, I should say. People face increased levels of risk, people are demanding compensation. These are things that we would expect, I would expect as a political economist, yet the traditional Irish party structure struggles to do this. The populist nationalism of the traditional Irish party structure struggles to be able to channel that representation. And so what we end up with, because of the nature of the electoral system, proportional representation, single transferable vote, it's a very proportional system, what we end up with is a fragmentation of the party system. The traditional parties cannot provide the representation they should be providing for those channels of grievances. Sinn Féin, in its populist reincarnation, attempts to capture some of that ground, but ultimately what we observe is the emergence of a whole host of independents and a whole host of smaller left-leaning parties. And as of this moment, I checked in my office just before I left, 156 of the 158 seats have now been accounted for. We are still waiting for two more. I was explaining to my colleagues before this, pure STV with the Hunt formula means that you go to multiple recounts. Some constituencies are now on count number 14. And this also means that they're often challenged because the margin of error is usually 20, 25 votes. And this is within the human margin of error, so then you have to start all over again. But of those 156 seats, there's 7 parties in the parliament and 23 independents. No party is going to be able to form a majority government, which doesn't happen in these types of electoral systems. But it becomes inconceivable to see how any party is going to form a meaningful coalition unless they are willing to get into bed with Sinn Féin. And that's probably just a little bit too soon, I think, for Irish politics. So what this means is that 100 years after the Rising, and the year that the Irish state and the national broadcaster Radio Televisión spent a whole ton of money on this series called 1916, the year that's being celebrated across the state, the official centenary anniversary celebrations of the 1916 Rising, there probably won't be an Irish government. And I would suggest that that's partly because of this particular dynamic that I've just discussed. I was going to go back to the Yates point. And what I would say is that while it's trite to say that revolutions devour their children, I think in the Irish context, or certainly in the context of the Irish party system, we have definitely seen a revolution give rise to a terrible beauty. That's why I went. Thank you.